For those of you watching at home or joining and don't know what MSC is, we're an education advocacy organization, and we push for proactive legislative efforts on the state and local level. We have over 100 students from 16 different Maryland counties, and our focus is mainly on empowering student voice through education policy and legislation. More information regarding our group can be found at the link tree that's going to be in the description of this video as we post. So the purpose of these events specifically is provide students an opportunity to ask candidates for Maryland governor, which is a very big deal, their stances on various education and youth-related issues. So this afternoon, we're joined by former U.S. Secretary of Education, John King. And it's a pleasure to have him. Secretary King, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the passion for civic engagement and advocating for student issues. So, yeah, eager to enter the discussion. Would be helpful, Chris, for me to share a little bit of my background and why I decided to run.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Great. Fantastic. So I really decided to run for governor for the same reasons that I got into public service in the first place. And that's deeply connected to the role that schools played in my life. When I was growing up, both my parents were educators. My dad was a teacher and administrator. My mom was a teacher and school counselor. But they both passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8 and my dad when I was 12. And home was incredibly difficult. Particularly after my mom passed, when it was just my dad and me. My dad was struggling with undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So home was very unstable. I didn't know what my father would be like from one night to the next. And the thing that saved me was school. School was the one place that was safe and nurturing and supportive. And after my dad passed, I moved around different family members, different schools, and I struggled the way a lot of kids who experience trauma at early ages struggle. And I actually got kicked out of high school. I always tell folks I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education have been kicked out of high school. But I was very lucky that folks didn't give up on me. It would have been easy to say, here's African-American, Latino male, family in crisis, no respect for authority. What chance does he have? And it would have been easy to write me off. But I was very lucky that there were teachers and a school counselor who were willing to give me a second chance, who were willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes. And because of their investment in me, I was able to go on to become a teacher and principal and try to do for other kids what teachers had done for me. Spent my career in education, first as a high school social studies teacher, and then as a middle school principal, then leading schools at the local level, state level, and then serving in the Obama administration, first as Deputy Secretary of Education, and then as Secretary of Education. And throughout my career, I was always focused on issues of equity, particularly for low-income students and students of color. When the administration ended, I took over a civil rights organization called Education Trust that works on education equity issues, early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. That's the work I've been doing since the end of the administration. But I also, when COVID hit, seeing the disparate impact COVID was having on low-income communities and communities of color in Maryland, launched an advocacy organization called Strong Future Maryland, which works on a range of issues, protecting folks from eviction, economic development for historically underserved communities, climate issues. And at Strong Future Maryland, our vision was we need this to be a New Deal moment. Our recovery from COVID can't just be about getting back to February 2020. It has to be about building a more just and equitable future. And that work at Strong Future Maryland, and my experience as an educator, seeing how kids and families are so profoundly affected by all the other systems operating in their lives, whether or not they have safe and affordable housing, whether or not they're food insecure, whether or not their families are caught up in criminal justice system and policies of mass incarceration. Those experiences really caused me to think about where can I have the greatest impact across sectors. And I think the next governor is going to be uniquely positioned to make government a force for good in people's lives the way schools were a force for good in mine. So that's what led me to decide to run. It's been a great experience so far. We launched at the end of the spring. We raised $1 million in our first 6 weeks. We spent the summer crisscrossing the state doing events now in almost every county. Got a couple left to go. And I've loved getting a chance to hear from folks about the challenges they face and some of the opportunities they see. I try to frame the campaign around a set of core pillars. One of those is education, of course. So I think education is at the foundation of the success of our economy and our democracy. We just passed, as you all know, significant K-12 school funding reform and the blueprint for Maryland's future. But the next governor will determine if the dollars are there or not. Both in Maryland and nationally, we've seen those kinds of bills pass with great fanfare, but then the money never comes. We got to make sure the resources are there for all the great elements of the blueprint. Increase the teacher compensation, the teacher career ladder model, making all of our high poverty schools community schools, expanding pre-K, investing in career and technical education. There's a lot of good stuff in there, but the next governor will determine if it actually happens. But I think that should be the floor, not the ceiling, for our investment in education. I also think we need to have universal access to affordable, quality childcare, birth through 5. I think that is achievable. I think we need to invest more in our community colleges and our HBCUs as engines of social mobility and economic opportunity. So education is one pillar. A second pillar is economic development and economic dignity. Investing in our growth. That means helping small businesses start and grow in the state. It means making sure we're preparing our Maryland workforce for the open jobs and cybersecurity and renewable energy and the green economy. But we also, as we think about economic development, have to think about economic dignity, right? People's quality of life. We don't have paid family leave in Maryland. We should. We are not doing enough to make sure we have a supply of affordable housing. We have underinvested in public transit. Those quality of life issues are also a part of how we measure our economic success. And then the third pillar for me is the environment and climate action. Obviously, you all know that Chesapeake plays a vital role in so many aspects of life in Maryland. We've got to protect the Chesapeake. But we also need very ambitious action, I think, on climate. And many Democrats say the words climate change, but then they aren't willing to do the things necessary to take on moving us away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We have to change building standards. We have to change transportation policy. We have to invest in growing offshore wind, solar, geothermal. We need to move all of our public buildings, our public car fleet, our transit buses, our school buses, all over to renewable energy. So we have a lot of work to do on climate action, but it's urgent work. And we have to do it with attention to issues of environmental justice. And then let me close with this, and then really eager for questions and conversation. As we do each of those things, we work on education and economic development and the environment, we have to do it with a racial equity lens. That for me is a matter of lived experience, a matter of principle. It is also a matter of appreciating the complexity of our history in Maryland around issues of race. So I'm talking to you from where I live in Silver Spring. It's about 25 miles from where my great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg, Maryland. The property where my great-grandfather was enslaved with his family, still owned by a family that are direct line descendants of the family that enslaved my family. Over the last few years, we've gotten a chance to get to know them and spend time on the property. The property's actually been maintained just as it was in the 1860s, same main house that was built in the 1700s, and the cabin that my great-grandfather lived in as an enslaved person with his family still standing on the property. So I've had the opportunity with my wife and my daughters, who are 15 and 18, to stand inside of that cabin. And what I contemplate standing inside that cabin is really two things. One, the incredible cruelty and intimacy of the institution of slavery. That cabin is not 30 yards from the main house. These were two families living in the same space, one owning the other. And so many of our challenges today, disparities in health and wealth, in our criminal justice system can be traced to that history of slavery and segregation and redlining. But the other thing I contemplate standing in that cabin is how profound it is that in my family, we went in 3 generations from enslaved in that cabin to serving in the cabinet of the first Black president. What a powerful statement that is about what's possible if we create opportunity. So ultimately, for me, this race for governor is about ensuring that we create opportunity for Marylanders in every region of the state, regardless of race, regardless of the language they speak at home, regardless of immigration status. All Marylanders deserve access to opportunity, and that's what I want to deliver as governor. So with that, would love folks' questions, comments.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Secretary King. So the format of this Q&A will be pretty straightforward. Each attendee can ask questions either through the chat, or we ask if you want to speak, turn on your camera or verbalize your question, just raise your hand and you will be called on by me. And then the response, if we can keep responses to questions of like maybe 1 to 3 minutes, just so that we have enough time to get through all of the questions, that would be good. And then we'll go in order, starting with our senior associates and directors, then to our associates, and then if time permits, open floor discussion. And yeah, that should be the ground rules. So let's get to the Q&A. And to start things off, I have a question just so we can get to the format. So if you could say one thing that would reach every student in the state of Maryland, we have almost 1 million students. Mm-hmm. What would you say to them and why?
Such an interesting question. I would urge every student to get involved in public service, in engaging with their community and with our politics and elected officials. I mean, I'm biased. I was a high school civics teacher, so but at the end of the day, I think we will not create a more just and equitable society, and we will not solve our biggest challenges if young people are not actively engaged in civic life. And I worry that for some young people who were involved, like my daughters last summer in the protests after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, there's a frustration that we haven't made more progress. And for young people who've been involved in some of the climate protests, I think a frustration that we haven't made more progress, that in our public policy, we still aren't really taking on climate in the way that we should. And so I don't want folks to get discouraged or to be cynical. We actually need them to double down on their activism and advocacy.
Thank you very much. So at this time, if any of the attendees would like to drop questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature and I'll call on you. If any directors have any questions as well. Okay, let's go to John.
And if you guys could tell me where you're from, I'd be curious to know.
Good afternoon, good evening, Secretary. Thank you so much for meeting with us. My name is John DePietro. I'm one of the directors of the Maryland Student Coalition. I'm from Columbia, Maryland, but currently I'm actually a freshman at American University, so calling you from Washington, D.C. I was very actually happy that you were just talking about student demonstrations, because our organization was basically founded out of an initiative in Howard County to try and promote students' rights to peacefully demonstrate in schools. And one of the big key things that we've been able to transition in our organization is trying to promote students' voices across across Maryland, primarily in the legislative process. As governor, what opportunities can make for students who are not within like student government associations, or wouldn't primarily be the people who would be focused on leadership opportunities? What would you do to try and get them into the political realm?
Yeah, Well, there's some mechanisms we have to protect, right? So there are folks who are trying to undermine the student member of the board in our school boards. So we got to make sure we protect that. So there's some defense that we need to play on student participation. You know, I would certainly love to see more young people testifying in Annapolis as the General Assembly is considering bills. One of the projects that I've been involved with is an organization called Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. And we were fortunate to partner with young people involved in March for Our Lives in advocating for changes to our gun laws in Maryland. And I think it's quite powerful when you have students testifying before the legislature, helping them understand the implications of the bills that they are considering. So more engagement in Annapolis, I think, is critical. When I was secretary, one of the things I tried to do was have regular, we would call it tea with students, but we would have students join the senior leadership of the department to talk through issues that were relevant to them. So I can recall one meeting we had with students who'd been homeless, and talking about some of the challenges they face in high school and college. And we literally walked out of that meeting and changed elements of the financial aid process based on feedback from students in that meeting. So that's something I would, as governor, want to make sure our agencies were reaching out to young people to hear about their experience. And then I think we need to do more at the local government level. Opportunities for students to be involved with local city council or county council, with school board on policy substance. I co-chair a national commission on K-12 climate action. And one of the things I've been excited about in that commission is we've heard from students who really pressured their school board to change their policies, to move to electric school buses, to install solar panels on school buildings, to change their practices. But it was because of student leadership. Like Salt Lake City, Utah has adopted a serious climate action plan because of student initiative. So we need to kind of foster that student voice. And I'm trying to engage students in the campaign, and we'll want to continue that as I govern.
All right, thank you so much. We'll now move to Lauren.
Hi, good afternoon,
Hi.
Secretary King. It's such a pleasure to meet with you. My name is Lauren Raskin. I am a current high school senior in Montgomery County. I go to Poolsville High School. But just once again, to preface, thank you so much for meeting with us today on behalf of MSC. It truly is such an honor. In your introductory, you made a brief mention about this, but as far as immigration policy goes, what are your current thoughts on Governor Hogan's initiatives and what he's done as far as immigration in the state of Maryland? And how do you intend on continuing immigration advocacy in the state should you be elected?
Yeah. Let me start by trying to say something nice. So I will point out that I appreciated that the governor welcomed Afghan refugees after the fall of the Afghani government. I thought that was the right thing to do, and I appreciated his leadership because, you know, we have to acknowledge that in the Republican Party, there's been a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. So I appreciate his leadership on that. That said, I think we have not done enough over the last few years to make Maryland a place that truly welcomes immigrants to the state. 3 quick examples. Many of the folks who do not have health insurance in Maryland are folks who are undocumented, and we should solve that. And I've proposed that we create a state insurance plan to make sure that folks who are undocumented have health care. It's better for them. It is also better for the community as a whole if we honor the fact that healthcare is a human right. 2, I just, a couple of weeks ago, spent a night with CASA sleeping outside to protest the governor's failure to maintain the state of emergency so that we could protect people from eviction. And we know that eviction will disproportionately fall on low-income communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities in particular, because landlords, unfortunately, see immigrants as a particularly vulnerable community that won't be as able to push back, in part because we don't fund the right to counsel in eviction hearings. So I worry a lot about the coming waves of evictions due to the economic consequences of COVID, and the governor has ignored that. And that to me is harmful to immigrant communities. A third area, we have a lot of folks in immigrant communities around the state that want to start small businesses, but they don't have adequate access to capital to start and grow those businesses. And we could do something about that. The state of North Dakota has a state bank. The state bank holds the state assets, and then through the community banks is able to help folks get loans who might not get loans from private commercial banks. And it's a way of using public resources to help people who are trying to build businesses in the state do so. We should have a state bank in Maryland. North Dakota has the most robust community banking sector in the country because of that state bank. We should do that in Maryland. So we've got to think about how we welcome immigrants into the state, and then we've got to make sure that folks have access to opportunity in the state. Thanks for asking about that, Lauren.
Absolutely. Thanks again for the question and for the response. We'll now go to Tanish.
Good afternoon, Secretary King. I'm Tanish Gupta. I'm from Washington County. I'm a senior here. I'm also the student member on the Board of Education for Washington County.
Nice.
So I'm definitely involved with a lot of the educational issues.
Mm-hmm.
So something that I've heard a lot of talk about everywhere, but I kind of fail to see action, especially in a community like Washington County, is equity in education. So I guess what is your substance on policy regarding equity in education?
Yeah, well, this is why I'm hopeful about the blueprint for Maryland's future, because we've got the opportunity to make some real progress on equity issues. In the blueprint, there's a commitment for more resources in the districts that have the greatest need. And so the funding formula is designed to get more resources to the districts that are serving the largest numbers of low-income students, of English learners, of students with disabilities. There's also resources in the blueprint to make high poverty schools community schools, where there'll be wraparound services to help address the needs of the students who face the greatest challenges outside of school. So, things like mental health services, help for students who are food insecure, housing insecure, programs for their parents to get adult education or ESL. So there's, I think, in the blueprint embedded some ways to address the needs of our students. We also advocated through my day job at the Education Trust, alongside CASA and Urban League and NAACP, for specific provisions in the blueprint that would address racial equity. And we formed a coalition called the Maryland Alliance for Racial Equity in Education. Some of the things we focus on is you should be able to take advanced courses in all high schools. There shouldn't be just AP in some schools and not available to others. So advanced placement, international baccalaureate, dual enrollment in college courses, those should be available to all students across all high schools. We know that Black and Latino students are underrepresented now in those courses. We have to work to make them more available. We don't have a diverse enough teacher workforce. In the United States, the majority of our kids are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. I think it's a problem that kids of color don't see enough educators who look like them, but it's a problem for white kids too, not to see a diverse community of adults in their schools. So there's an effort in the blueprint to try to address our supply of diverse, well-prepared teachers. So there's good stuff in the blueprint that should help us to tackle equity. I think that should be the floor, not the ceiling. We've got to build on that. We've proposed loan forgiveness to try to attract, particularly math, science teachers, bilingual teachers, places where we're really struggling to recruit folks. Attract those teachers, particularly to high needs urban and rural schools. I mentioned universal childcare, birth through 5. we have equity gaps starting in kindergarten, and one of the ways to address that is to invest in early childhood education. So I really appreciate your advocacy as a student member of the board. I hope you'll keep pushing your board colleagues on equity issues, and I want to be an ally as governor.
Perfect. So it looks like we have time for a couple more questions. So we'll go to Christopher next.
Hello, my name is Christopher Howell. I am a freshman currently in school, and I would like to ask, was there ever a law that you had difficulty getting to pass?
Well, I was education secretary during the second term of the Obama administration when we had a Republican Congress. So almost everything we tried to get passed was difficult. I'll tell you one really hopeful story about that, though. One of the things that we wanted to do was to address a really problematic legacy of the '94 crime bill. In the '94 crime bill, there were many bad provisions that drove mass incarceration in this country. But one of the bad provisions was a ban on access to Pell Grants for students who are incarcerated. Pell Grants are the main, as you all know, the main federal assistance for low-income students to pursue higher education. When that ban was put in place in '94, what happened was programs that were providing college courses in prisons all over the country closed. And a few stayed open with philanthropy, but many, many programs closed. In fact, I talked to one woman who was incarcerated at the time. She said that guards came and took the books out of the library and said, well, you won't need these anymore, right? As part of this whole movement at the time around tough on crime and so forth. It was a mistake and wrong, it was bad public policy, and we wanted to fix that, but we couldn't persuade Congress to do anything about it, given the Republican Congress. So we used our experimental authority under the Higher Education Act to create a pilot program, 65 colleges and universities that we were able to allow to use Pell Grants for incarcerated students. And I visited many of the programs. Incredible, so transformative for folks to have access to educational opportunity so that when they go home, they're better able to be successful. And 95% of the folks who are incarcerated are coming home. It's in everybody's interest for folks to get more skills. But the idea with the pilot was we were going to use that to help influence Congress over time. So then when I left the administration at the end of the Obama administration, I went to the Education Trust, and we partnered with criminal justice reform organizations to get members of Congress and governors to visit these, what we called second chance Pell programs. And folks were so moved by talking with the students about their journey that we were able to get real bipartisan momentum. And actually last December, Congress changed the law, and now Pell Grants are going to be available to all incarcerated students. So, it has been difficult sometimes to change the law, but you got to see it, you got to play a long game and work over time to move the conversation. We were able to do that with the Pell program.
All right, thank you so much. Looks like we have time for one more brief question and brief response. So I'll go to Hunter.
Well, it's not a brief question, but I'll try my best to give it as quickly as possible. Hello, Secretary King. It is a pleasure to meet you. My name's Hunter. I'm a director as well as the Maryland Student Coalition, and I'm a student at Howard Community College. So my question is about the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has presented a multitude of issues with the education system. Some include the digital divide, the disproportionalities it's presented, as well as well-being. As someone who has as someone with a tremendous record of resilience, how do you plan on addressing the COVID-19 recovery, especially for the most vulnerable students, such as farm students, special education students, and students with struggle with mental health?
Yeah. It's a big question. So I'll try to be efficient in the answer. I will say I put in the chat our education policy plan. We had 2,000 people on a telephone town hall when we rolled that out, but I encourage you to check it out and walks through our early childhood K-12 and higher education plans. On COVID, I think there are sort of three core things we need to do, assuming that we take care of the basics, which is, I hope we've learned at this point that every student should have a device and every student should have internet access. And hopefully there'll be a bipartisan infrastructure bill here soon if Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema get their act together, and that will allow us to do more on broadband access throughout the state. So we start there with the basics, but to address the impact that the disruption of school has had, I think there are three core things we should do. One is, I think we should mobilize a statewide tutoring corps. Young people who've recently graduated from college, retired teachers. We should mobilize tutors to provide high quality, intensive tutoring for the students who need additional academic support. And we have good evidence, really decades of evidence, that tutoring with well-trained tutors, a sustained relationship over time, high quality materials can help students make very rapid progress. So we should make that investment. We've got American Rescue Plan dollars that we could use. We've got a $2.5 billion state surplus. We have plenty of resources. We should invest that in tutoring. Two, we need more time. It's especially true for students with disabilities and English learners who've missed a lot of the kind of intervention supports that usually would have happened over the last year and a half. We need more time after school, time in the summer. Again, it has to be high quality, has to be well designed, has to include what I sometimes call ice cream with the broccoli, right? Because you need students to want to show up for those summer programs. So you need sports and arts and theater and robotics and stuff that's cool that makes kids want to be there for summer programming so that you can make up that time. But we need more time. And the third piece, and this has gotten less attention, but I think there's been a huge socio-emotional toll of this period. My daughter, as I mentioned, are 15, 18. I have a high school sophomore and a college freshman. Last year, their entire school year was virtual. They have a ton of privilege. It was really hard. It was really hard to be separated from friends, from teachers, really hard to focus on class when it's just empty boxes and the teacher talking for 45 minutes over and over throughout the day. It was just a really hard year and took a toll. But we have kids who lost parents to COVID, whose family lost income, whose families lost their homes. All that is traumatic. And so we need to invest, I think, in social workers, counselors, mental health services to address the socio-emotional impact of COVID. And again, we have the resources. We have the American Rescue Plan dollars. We have the state surplus. We have the resources, but we need school districts, we need folks like Tanish pushing their school board to make those investments. I talked to a union leader in Calvert County today. She's got counselors who are in elementary schools who have 600, 700 students for one counselor. How is a counselor going to be helpful to 600, 700 students? Just not possible. We need to invest more.
So, okay, great. So we're running a little low on time. Thank you for that response. I just want to end with some final reminders and everything. So first of all, can we give a virtual round of applause, Secretary King, for taking the time to speak with us today. Really do appreciate your time with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. So I just want to remind everybody that our next Q&A is scheduled for November 5th at 4 p.m. We'll be having the Comptroller of Maryland, Peter Francho, and more information on that will be sent out via our email list. And also we'll have a registration form on our Linktree. So with less than a minute, Secretary King, do you have any final closing words before we depart?
Just thanks for inviting me, and thanks for staying active. I hope you'll get involved with our campaign. Come to our website, johnkingforgovernor.com. But even if you don't get involved in our campaign, I hope you'll get involved in a campaign, because we've seen during this COVID period how important governors are. We need a great next governor in Maryland, and I hope you'll get involved.
Perfect. With that, thank you very much. This concludes our Q&A forum, and have a great rest of your night.
Thanks. Take care, everybody.